What if everything you believed about your favorite Hollywood icon was a carefully crafted lie? What if the man who made you laugh, made you think, made you feel like goodness still existed in the world, was hiding something behind the camera far more sinister than any script he ever wrote? What if the perfect family, the warm smile, the outspoken values were nothing but camouflage? Because on a quiet Sunday morning in Los Angeles, in a house wrapped in sunlight and silence, something happened that would shake that illusion to its core. Two bodies, one son, and a confession that made headlines until it made no sense. This is the story of Rob Reiner, beloved director, champion of political causes, devoted husband, loving father, or so we thought. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But this isn't just a story about a man. It's about a machine, a culture, a myth that we all helped build, and one that might be crumbling in real time. And the truth? It's way worse than we imagined. Because once you start digging into this mystery, something becomes painfully clear. It's not just a story about death. It's a story about silence, about power, about the things we refuse to see until it's too late. Let's begin. They say you should never meet your heroes. But what they don't tell you is, sometimes, you shouldn't even trust the stories told about them. Rob Reiner was a hero to millions. For decades, he stood at the intersection of art and activism, his voice unwavering in the face of political corruption, social injustice, and cultural division. He gave us When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, Stand By Me. He gave us laughter. He gave us conscience. He gave us hope. But behind the cinematic accolades and the progressive tweets, was there something else? That's the question echoing across the internet in the wake of an alleged tragedy so twisted, so unthinkable, that even Rob's most vocal critics were left speechless. Sunday morning, Los Angeles. Paramedics arrive to a gated estate in Brentwood. Neighbors report screaming. Police cordon off the street. Reporters swarm the scene. By noon, the names are leaked. Rob Reiner, Michelle Singer Reiner, both found dead inside their home. And standing at the center of the chaos? Their son, Nick Reiner, quiet, reclusive, former addict turned screenwriter, a man who had lived in the shadow of his father's fame for years, now in handcuffs. And then, shockingly, swiftly, comes the headline that sets everything on fire. Nick has confessed. He says he did it. The unthinkable, the unforgivable. He says he killed his parents. But why? Why would a man who had everything to prove, everything to reclaim, destroy the very people who gave him life? Why would someone raised in privilege, in fame, in comfort snap? Unless there's more to the story. Because almost as quickly as the confession hit the airwaves, doubts began to creep in. Pieces that didn't fit, timelines that contradicted themselves, details that slipped, changed, disappeared. And one key question: if Nick confessed, why doesn't the evidence match? It's a question the media won't ask. It's a question Hollywood won't touch. But it's the one we're going to dig into. Because once you pull at the first thread, the entire fabric of the Reiner family starts to unravel. And it doesn't just unravel, it explodes. But first, let's talk about why this story matters. Because it's not just about a family. It's about us. We live in a world addicted to outrage. One tweet, one headline, one soundbite, and the court of public opinion delivers its verdict before a single fact is confirmed. Celebrities aren't just entertainers anymore. They're symbols. We project our hopes, our anger, our pain onto them. And when they fail, when they fall, we eat it up. So when news broke that a liberal Hollywood legend and his wife were found dead, and their own son claimed responsibility, the internet didn't hesitate. They believed it. They wanted to believe it. Because what could be more deliciously ironic than the moral compass of Hollywood getting shattered from within? But what if that irony was planted? What if the narrative was manufactured? What if Nick Reiner isn't the villain? Or worse, what if he is the villain, but he's not the only one? Because as you'll soon see, this story isn't black and white. It's gray, blood red gray, twisted timelines, psychological manipulation, power games, and buried inside it all, a hidden history. A history of control, of secrets, of a family fractured long before the cameras stopped rolling. And one final act that no scriptwriter could have made believable until now. Here's what we know. Or at least, what we think we know. Rob Reiner was 78. Michelle, 68. They were reportedly found in the upstairs bedroom, no signs of forced entry. Nick called 911 himself. Calm. Methodical. Too calm. He waited for the police. Told them he was responsible. Offered no resistance. He was taken in. Booked. Held. And that was that. Or was it? Because what happened before that moment is far murkier. And what happened after the confession? Well, we'll get to that. But here's a question for you. If someone tells you they're guilty, do you believe them? Would you? Should you? Especially if that someone has a long history of mental health struggles and a complicated relationship with truth? Because according to early reports, Nick's confession came without a lawyer. No audio recording. Just a scribbled signature on a document that mysteriously vanished from the official file days later. And that's just the beginning. A beginning that leads to conflicting witness statements, suppressed evidence, and a motive that doesn't make sense. Nick said he did it. But who benefits from that? Certainly not Nick. And if not him, who? As we peel back the layers of this case, you're going to encounter a lot of uncomfortable truths about the way Hollywood protects its own, about the way trauma is ignored when it's inconvenient, about the way silence can be more dangerous than rage. You'll hear about a family that looked perfect from the outside, but inside was fractured by unspoken resentment, power struggles, and emotional neglect. You'll meet people who tried to sound the alarm years ago and were ignored. You'll learn about a confession that doesn't match the crime scene. And most disturbingly, you'll discover that someone else might have been in that house. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we unpack what really happened on that Sunday morning, we need to understand how we got there. We need to go back, decades back, to the beginning of the Reiner story, to the legacy, to the image, to the son who grew up in the shadow of a man the world loved, but who may never have loved him back. Because until you understand the family dynamic, you won't understand the crime. If it even was a crime, or if it was something far darker, something orchestrated, something covered up, something that still hasn't been fully uncovered yet. So now we go deeper, into the myth, into the marriage, into the mind of a son who confessed to the worst crime imaginable, and maybe into a world that doesn't want the truth out. Because the more you learn, the more you'll realize. The official story is just the trailer. The real film? It hasn't even started yet. But what comes next will change everything, and no one saw it coming. He was the warm father figure on your screen. The man who gave us Meathead and All in the Family. The voice behind, You Can't Handle the Truth. The champion of progress, equality, and decency in Hollywood. Rob Reiner wasn't just another celebrity. He was the celebrity you were supposed to trust. He was the one who didn't sell out. The one who aged gracefully. The one who turned his fame into purpose. From anti-war speeches to viral political tweets, he positioned himself as Hollywood's conscience. A filmmaker with a soul. A father. A husband. A fighter for what's right. But here's the real question. How much of that was real? And how much was carefully curated? Let's rewind. Born into the glittering spotlight of Hollywood royalty, Rob Reiner was practically baptized in fame. His father? Carl Reiner, legendary comedian, writer, director, and Sid Caesar's right-hand man. The Reiner name carried prestige, charm, and a deep-rooted image of wholesomeness. Rob wasn't just born into privilege. He was born into a brand. And from a young age, he knew exactly how the industry worked. How to perform. How to smile. How to make you feel like he got you. But growing up in the Reiner household wasn't all punchlines and applause. Behind the success was pressure. The kind of pressure only legacy can bring. How do you step into the shoes of a comedy titan? How do you not disappoint an audience that thinks they already know you? Rob's answer? You become the hero of your own narrative. You control the story before anyone else does. And for decades, that's exactly what he did. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't scandalous. He didn't overdose, divorce, or spiral. Instead, he built a reputation brick by brick. First as an actor, then as a director, and finally as a respected political voice. In the 1980s, his directorial debut This Is Spinal Tap proved he could be more than just Carl Reiner's son. Then came Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men. Every film seemed to whisper, this guy gets it. Heartfelt, smart, honest. Like he was pulling truth out of thin air and shaping it into screenplays. But here's where it gets interesting. Rob didn't just make movies about truth. He made himself the symbol of it. He started speaking out against war, against Trump, against corruption. He co-founded the committee to investigate Russia. He tweeted almost daily about saving democracy. And the public? They ate it up. Because in a world of moral grayness, Rob Reiner made people feel like someone still knew right from wrong. He was the Hollywood dad they wished they had. But while Rob was being elevated to moral sainthood, something else was happening behind closed doors. Behind every image is a cost. And in Rob's case, that cost may have been his own family. Friends say Rob was intensely focused, hyper-disciplined, driven by perfection and appearances. But driven men often cast long shadows. And standing in that shadow, Nick, the son the world barely knew existed. A child of fame who never quite fit the frame. Nick Reiner was the opposite of his father. Awkward in public, withdrawn, struggling with addiction by his teens. While Rob stood at award podiums, Nick sat in rehab. While Rob was hailed for truth-telling, Nick was reportedly spiraling into lies. While Rob's voice trended, Nick's was silenced. To the public, Rob was the ideal father. To Nick, maybe something else entirely. It's not uncommon. Celebrities often craft glowing images while their children drift into dysfunction. We see it again and again, famous parent, lost child. But in this case, the contrast was too stark to ignore. Rob's Twitter was full of moral clarity. Nick's reality was full of confusion. Rob was praised for integrity. Nick was allegedly battling demons the public never saw. And yet, Rob rarely spoke about Nick in interviews. He talked about politics. He talked about the state of the world. But when it came to family, silence, as if the image of fatherhood was more important than the reality of it. And that brings us to a chilling thought. What happens when a public image becomes more sacred than private truth? Could a man so focused on perception ignore the cracks forming in his own home? Or worse, help create them? Because according to whispers from those close to the family, the Reiner household was not the sanctuary it appeared to be. One insider described it as coldly organized. Another said Rob kept emotion at arm's length. Even Michelle, his wife of over 30 years, was said to walk on eggshells around him in later years. Of course, no marriage is perfect, but some are far from it. And in the Reiner house, perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. It makes you wonder, was Rob Reiner a man trying to uphold truth, or trying to escape his own? Because here's a contradiction that hits like a punch to the gut. While Rob crusade for mental health policy on Twitter, his own son was allegedly drowning in depression, untreated and unheard. While Rob funded documentaries about corruption and justice, Nick was reportedly telling friends that no one believes me, not even my dad. And while Rob gave interviews about healing a broken America, his own family was shattering behind the scenes. If that doesn't make your stomach twist, it should, because it raises a haunting question. Did Rob Reiner's obsession with truth make him blind to the lies in his own life? But here's the real twist. Rob may have believed his image so deeply that he couldn't see what was happening right under his nose. Some say denial is a defense mechanism. Others say it's a choice. Either way, by the time Sunday morning arrived, it was too late. The damage had been done. The cracks had spread, and the image America trusted had already begun to crumble. Now, let's rewind to just 3 days before the incident. Rob tweets a message about preserving justice in a corrupt system. It gets 2.3 million views. What no one knew, that tweet would be his last. And 3 days later, the system he so proudly defended, the system of truth, justice, and accountability, would come knocking at his front door. Only this time, the cameras weren't rolling. There was no script, no moral clarity, just silence, sirens, and a son in cuffs. Was it the ultimate irony? Or was it a tragedy long in the making? Because the more we examine Rob Reiner's public legacy, the more we find gaps, wide, glaring ones, between what he said and what he lived. The man who told us, "You can't handle the truth," may have been hiding one so devastating, even he couldn't face it. And the son who lived in his shadow might have finally stepped into the spotlight in the worst way imaginable. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if the most carefully hidden cracks in this story weren't between father and son, but between husband and wife? On the surface, they were the image of quiet success. Rob Reiner, and Michelle Singer Reiner. 34 years of marriage. No cheating scandals. No tabloid meltdowns. No high-profile court battles. No social media feuds. In an industry defined by messy divorces and career-first marriages, theirs was calm, predictable, stable, or at least that's how it looked. But you and I both know, silence doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes, silence is strategy, and sometimes, it's survival. When Rob met Michelle Singer in the late 1980s, he was a man already transformed. Fresh off the success of The Princess Bride, his career was skyrocketing. He was in his 40s, a director reinventing himself, no longer just meathead from TV. She was younger, artistic, private, elegant. They clicked. But this wasn't a whirlwind celebrity affair. No paparazzi chases. No million-dollar weddings. No press tours. Just two people stepping into each other's lives quietly, deliberately. And that tone set the rhythm for their entire relationship. Private, controlled, and, according to some insiders, strangely distant. Let's be clear. This chapter isn't about scandal. It's about disconnection. Because as we dig deeper into the events that led up to that fateful Sunday, one thing becomes clear. There were two marriages happening inside the Reiner household. One the public was sold, and one that played out behind the walls of their Los Angeles home. Start with the way they presented themselves. Red carpets? Rare. Joint interviews? Almost non-existent. Social media posts? Zero. Even in Hollywood, where many couples manufacture public intimacy for branding, the Reiners stood apart by standing apart. Some called it classy. Others, those who knew them, called it something else. Emotionally disconnected. They were never warm, said one former assistant. They operated more like business partners than lovers. Others described the house as eerily quiet, too clean, museum-like. And that's not just a vibe, it's a warning. Because when you walk into a home and feel nothing, that's not peace. That's emotional drought. But maybe Michelle didn't mind. Maybe that was the price she paid for stability, for wealth, for access, for being Mrs. Reiner. Or maybe she minded deeply, but said nothing. Because here's the thing no one talks about. Not every toxic relationship is explosive. Some are cold wars, long stretches of silence broken only by passive control. Rob Reiner, for all his activism and moral fire, was known to be intense, structured, unyielding, everything in its place. And when a man is that obsessed with order outside the home, what do you think he demands inside? The signs were subtle, like how Michelle stopped attending premieres after 2017, or how her name gradually disappeared from any public association with his work. No producer credits, no creative input, not even a +1 in event seating charts. Sources close to the couple described her as ghost-like in recent years. Still present, but fading. She was there, but not, one family friend said. Like a painting on the wall. And that's the contradiction no one saw coming. While Rob was building a persona of boldness and public moral courage, the woman closest to him seemed to be growing quieter, smaller, fainter. Did he notice? Did he care? Or had they both silently agreed to play their roles until the final curtain? Because here's a detail that keeps resurfacing in private circles. Michelle may have been trying to leave. In the months leading up to the incident, she reportedly consulted a lawyer. Not about divorce. About separation of assets. That's not gossip. That's paper trail. Documents filed, then suddenly withdrawn. Frozen accounts. A trust amended quietly. A private meeting with a financial advisor, alone. So now we have to ask, what was happening in that house? What was she planning? And did Rob know? Because the timeline suggests something haunting. Michelle's shift toward independence coincided directly with Nick's reappearance. The son who had largely been estranged from both parents for years suddenly started visiting again. Brief visits at first, then longer stays. Then, reportedly, staying overnight. And here's the kicker. Rob wasn't always home. Some insiders claim Michelle and Nick were growing closer during this time. Not inappropriately, but emotionally. Mother and son reconnecting, bonding, healing. And for a man like Rob, who carefully controlled everything, that may have felt like betrayal. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't his idea. Let's zoom in on one moment. A neighbor reported hearing an argument through an open window 2 weeks before the incident. Not shouting, but tension. Voices low and sharp. Words like disrespect, ungrateful, and you owe me everything. Not between Nick and Rob. Between Rob and Michelle. It's a small moment. A sliver. But it changes the narrative. Because now, this isn't just a father-son powder keg. It's a triangle. Power. Loyalty. Silence. And when power gets threatened, loyalty fractures, and silence turns lethal. Let's talk psychology for a moment. In toxic family systems, when a child has been cast out, like Nick, and then brought back in through one parent's forgiveness, the other parent often feels replaced, undermined, threatened. And if that parent is someone who's built his entire world on being in control, being seen as righteous, and being unquestioned, that emotional displacement isn't just painful. It's dangerous, because it threatens the entire identity they've spent decades crafting. And Rob Reiner's identity wasn't just personal. It was public property. He was the guy who got it, who knew right from wrong, who wasn't like the other Hollywood phonies. So what happens when that man looks into his home and sees his son, the addict, the disappointment, the outsider, being embraced by the woman who once stood by him? It becomes a betrayal. Not loud, not violent, but slow, creeping, corrosive. Now let's return to the Sunday in question. Police logs confirm Michelle was found in a different room from Rob. Not in bed beside him, not in the same space. They were both in the house, but apart. Physically, emotionally, symbolically. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no broken furniture, just stillness. Which raises the question, was this sudden, or was this planned? And by whom? Because here's the twist that investigators are still trying to untangle. Michelle's last known phone call, made at 11:06 p.m. the night before, wasn't to 911. It wasn't to a friend. It wasn't to a lawyer. It was to Nick. A missed call, 1 minute in length. Never returned. What did she want to say? Was it a warning? A plea? A confession? We may never know. But that 1-minute ring could be the thread that unravels everything. Because it suggests that in her final hours, Michelle wasn't calling for help. She was reaching for her son, the one she may have spent decades being told to avoid. And perhaps, the only one who was really listening. It's a story as old as time, isn't it? The man who builds an empire of righteousness. The woman who stands quietly beside him. The child who is cast out. And the moment it all comes crashing down when the script is no longer followed. But the real question is, who wrote the ending? Was it the son, stepping into a role he didn't want? Was it the mother, trying to change the story too late? Or was it the father, tightening his grip as everything slipped away? Whatever the answer is, one thing's for sure. This wasn't a story of sudden chaos. It was a slow burn, and it had been smoldering for years. But what came next would turn that quiet fire into a roaring inferno, and no one saw it coming. What happens to a boy raised in the glow of his father's spotlight, only to realize that light was never meant for him? Nick Reiner. If you didn't know his name before the headlines, you weren't alone. He's been the invisible thread in Rob Reiner's life story, tugged on when necessary, tucked away when inconvenient. But now, that thread has unraveled. And at the center of this entire mystery is the quiet son no one was watching. The boy who grew up in the corner of the frame. The teenager who fell out of step with the family script. The man now accused of ending the very legacy he was born into. But let's stop right here. Because the version of Nick you think you know, the addict, the troubled son, the confessed killer, is only one layer. There's another story. A deeper one. A darker one. One that begins not with a crime, but with a childhood that never really belonged to him. Nick Reiner was born in 1993, the only son of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer. By then, Rob was already a legend. Not just famous, established, respected, untouchable. Nick didn't grow up with a father on the rise. He grew up with a father already at the top. And that changes everything. Because when your dad is America's moral compass, there's no room for you to make mistakes. Especially if your name carries the weight of a legacy. Nick wasn't just expected to succeed. He was expected to fit the brand. But Nick was different. Shy, sensitive, overwhelmed by crowds. He preferred books to cameras, solitude to red carpets. In early interviews, Rob would joke about Nick being moody or quirky. What he meant was, Nick didn't play the part. And in Hollywood families, that's a problem. You can't just be yourself. You have to make sense to the narrative. You have to either be your parents' mini-me or their redemption arc. Nick was neither. And so, the gap between father and son grew. Quietly. Consistently. Tragically. By age 12, Nick was struggling with anxiety. By 13, depression. By 15, he was using not just weed, pills, opioids, whatever numbed the pressure. And by 17, rehab. Not once. For times. But here's where things take a turn. Because Rob, publicly a champion for mental health, was strangely absent from this part of the narrative. No interviews. No support campaigns. No appearances with Nick. In fact, for several years, Nick disappeared entirely from the public eye. It was like he'd been erased. And maybe, in a way, he had. Those close to the family say Rob treated Nick's struggles as inconvenient. He couldn't reconcile being the voice of moral clarity with having a son in pain, said one former staffer. Another added, it's like Nick was a failed subplot in the Reiner story, something to cut from the final edit. And that's not just cruel. It's dangerous. Because when someone feels unseen, they don't just get sad. They get hollow. And a hollow child becomes a haunted adult. Nick did eventually resurface. In 2015, he co-wrote a semi-autobiographical film titled Being Charlie, about a young man battling addiction and feeling abandoned by his powerful father. Sound familiar? The movie was quietly released. Mixed reviews. Barely promoted. But it was more than a movie. It was a cry for help. A confession wrapped in fiction. And do you know who directed it? Rob. Yes. Rob Reiner directed his son's own story of pain. But rather than embracing it, he sanitized it, made it digestible, turned his son's trauma into a teachable moment for himself. And once again, Nick was sidelined, even in his own narrative. Think about that. You're drowning. You write a story to save yourself. Your father takes it, turns it into content, and in every interview, talks about how he learned something. Not you. Him. That's not healing. That's exploitation. And it wasn't just emotional exploitation. Behind the scenes, the father-son relationship remained strained. Nick reportedly lived on and off in guest houses, hotels, sometimes couch surfing. He struggled to hold jobs, form relationships, build stability. And though there were moments of reconciliation, friends say it was always conditional. When Nick behaved, he got access, said one friend. When he slipped, he vanished. This wasn't healing. This was transaction. And by the time Nick turned 30, he had reportedly stopped trying. He was quiet, distant, a shadow. But shadows don't stay quiet forever. And Nick's reappearance in the Reiner household in the months before the tragedy wasn't a coincidence. He had been invited back. By who? That's the million-dollar question. Some say Michelle extended the olive branch. Others say Rob orchestrated a family reunion for PR optics. Either way, Nick returned. And that's where the tension started to boil. Because Rob's world was built on consistency, his routines, his image, his moral clarity. And now here was Nick, unpredictable, raw, inconvenient. Back in the house, not as a son, but as a reminder of all the things Rob couldn't control. In private conversations, Nick allegedly told friends that being in the house again felt like suffocating in memory. He said the walls whispered expectations, that his father still didn't look at him fully, that Michelle, while kind, seemed scared all the time. Not scared of Nick, scared of what was being unearthed by his return. And that's where this gets dark. Because Nick may not have come back for reconciliation. He may have come back for answers. There were rumors, whispers, family secrets that had always been denied, buried, ignored. And Nick? He wanted to know the truth. One night, a neighbor saw Nick pacing outside the house alone, muttering to himself, hands shaking. When asked if he was okay, he reportedly said, "I know something, but they won't say it out loud." What did he mean? What did he know? Was it just the ramblings of a distressed mind? Or was it something more? And now, the confession. Because let's not forget, Nick did confess. He told the police it was him. He described it calmly, mechanically, no emotion. But what if that calm wasn't guilt? What if it was resignation? What if, after a lifetime of being silenced, erased, and manipulated, Nick simply gave them the ending they wanted? An ending where he's the villain. An ending where the narrative fits. But one where the truth dies with him. Because here's what no one wants to admit. There are gaps in the confession. Details that don't match. Timelines that contradict. Forensic evidence that doesn't add up. And yet, Nick remains in custody. Silent. Just like always. A shadow. Only now, a shadow with blood on his hands. Or so they want us to believe. But what came next shattered even that version of the truth, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the truth hasn't even been confirmed, but the world has already picked a villain, written the script, and moved on? It didn't take long. 43 minutes, to be exact. That's how long it took for the first tweet to go viral. Breaking: Rob Reiner and wife found dead. Son Nick Reiner confesses. No source, no citation, no context, just fire. And fire spreads. Within 2 hours, the internet had transformed an unconfirmed tragedy into a complete narrative. Rob and Michelle, innocent victims. Nick, deranged, guilty, evil. End of story. Except, the real story hadn't even started. Because while paramedics were still clearing the scene and officers were still processing evidence, the court of public opinion had already held its trial. And Nick Reiner? He was already sentenced. Let's be honest. We live in a time where facts are slow and feelings are fast. Where "I heard" is more powerful than "I know." And in that gap, between silence and information, the internet fills in the blanks. Sometimes with memes, sometimes with lies, but always with certainty. And in this case, the certainty was absolute. Because people wanted to believe Nick did it. They needed it. Because that version made sense. Because it felt poetic. Think about it. Rob Reiner was a moral voice, a Hollywood progressive, a critic of corruption and hypocrisy. For years, he'd positioned himself as a compass in a broken world. So when he fell, when something horrible happened to him, people wanted a twist. They didn't want a random intruder. They didn't want unsolved. They wanted Shakespeare. They wanted the prodigal son to turn into Cain. They wanted narrative justice. And Nick? He fit the role perfectly. Addict, estranged, troubled, unknown. He was exactly what the internet needed him to be. And so, the story was born. Not from police, not from journalists, but from Twitter threads, TikTok videos, and Reddit speculation. Nick wasn't just accused, he was dissected. Old photos were reposted with chilling captions. Look at his eyes. Total psycho vibe. This dude always looked off. Clips from Being Charlie were framed as early signs of violence. Screenshots of fictional scripts were cited as proof. People even posted fake DMs, claiming they'd known Nick in high school and always suspected he was capable of something like this. It didn't matter that half of it was fiction. It felt true. And that was enough. Let's pause and ask the uncomfortable question. Why do we rush to believe the worst version of someone, especially when we don't know them? Is it projection? Is it emotional laziness? Or is it something deeper? A kind of collective bloodlust masked as justice? Because that's what happened to Nick. He didn't just get accused. He became a symbol, not of grief, not of tragedy, but of guilt, instant guilt. And anyone who questioned it, they were shouted down. Don't defend a murderer. Stop victim blaming. His confession is all we need. Except, the confession wasn't public. The police hadn't released any footage. There was no mugshot, no forensic report, no autopsy findings. Just a whisper, amplified into a roar. It's worth looking at how fast the headlines escalated. From Rob Reiner and wife found dead, to Rob Reiner murdered by son, to Rob Reiner's son has history of violence, to Hollywood's dark secret finally exposed. Each one bolder than the last. Each one feeding the machine. Because once the internet finds a narrative that gets clicks, it doesn't let go. Even if it's wrong. Especially if it's wrong. Because outrage sells better than accuracy. And then came the influencers. YouTubers. TikTokers. True crime podcasters. People who had never mentioned Rob or Nick before. Suddenly dissecting every moment of their lives. Creating timelines. Analyzing body language from decade-old interviews. Speculating about mental illness, hidden abuse, secret motivations. Some even claimed Nick had a manifesto. Others said Rob was working on a secret political film and was taken out. Conspiracies bloomed like weeds. All while the official investigation remained silent. Because they had to be. Because real investigations take time. But the internet? It doesn't wait. It doesn't care. It only devours. And here's where things get tragic. Because someone, somewhere, could have spoken up. A friend, a colleague, a journalist with integrity. They could have said, hey, this story is still developing. Let's not jump to conclusions. But they didn't. Because silence is safer than dissent. And clicks pay more than caution. And Nick? He wasn't just easy to blame. He was profitable. Let's talk numbers. In the first 24 hours after the news broke, Nick Reiner's name was searched more than 12 million times. Hashtags like hashtag Nick Reiner Killer and hashtag Justice for Rob trended globally. Hundreds of YouTube videos appeared overnight, some with ads, some with sponsors, all profiting from a story that hadn't been verified. Think about that. Nick went from anonymous to infamous before any official statement was made. He was turned into a character, a villain, a clickbait icon, all while sitting in a holding cell, likely in shock, likely still processing what had happened and what was being done to him. But what if the story isn't what we think? What if the confession was coerced? What if the timeline doesn't line up? What if someone else was there? What if Nick, far from being a monster, was just a man at the center of a tragedy he didn't cause? Would it matter? Would we care? Or have we already moved on? Because once the internet picks a villain, it never rewrites the script, even when the truth starts to surface. And make no mistake, the truth is starting to surface. Inconsistencies, witness contradictions, leaked reports. But the world isn't listening anymore. They've moved on. Nick served his purpose in the machine. He was a headline, a cautionary tale, a meme. And now? Now he's disposable. But what came next forced even the loudest voices online to stop and reconsider, and no one saw it coming. He confessed. He said he did it. But what if the story he told couldn't have happened? Let's start with the one thing no one wants to challenge. Nick Reiner confessed. He told police he was responsible for the deaths of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. He was calm, direct, precise. There were no screams, no breakdown, just acceptance. But here's what no one tells you about confessions. They're not always the truth, especially when they come too easily, especially when they contradict reality, especially when they sound rehearsed. Let's go back to the scene. According to LAPD sources, when officers arrived, Nick was waiting outside, sitting on the front steps, hands resting on his knees. No blood, no visible injuries, no signs of a struggle. The 911 call? It didn't come from a neighbor. It came from Nick himself. He called in the deaths. He identified himself as the killer. And then he waited. Didn't run. Didn't hide. Didn't lawyer up. At first glance, it sounds like a guilty conscience. But dig a little deeper, and nothing makes sense. Because the official story, Nick kills both parents, calls it in, sits calmly, is missing something critical. The how. How did he do it? With what? And where's the evidence? Because here's the problem. No murder weapon was ever found. Let that sink in. 2 people, allegedly killed by their son. And no murder weapon. Nothing on him. Nothing in the house. Nothing in the yard. No fingerprints. No DNA. No defensive wounds on Rob or Michelle. No bruises on Nick. No signs of restraint, struggle, or sedation. So if he did it, how? And why confess if the crime scene didn't support it? Let's look at the details of the confession itself. Sources say Nick told police that he snapped, that he couldn't take the judgment anymore, that he wanted them to feel what he felt. Strong words, emotional words, but vague, too vague. Police asked for specifics. He gave none. He didn't know the time of death, didn't describe the method, couldn't even remember where he was when they died. He said, "I just did it." That's not a confession. That's a narrative placeholder. The kind someone gives when they think they're supposed to confess, or when they've been told that confession is the only way out. Now ask yourself, why would someone admit to a crime they didn't commit? It sounds crazy until you understand psychology. Because false confessions are far more common than most people realize, especially under emotional distress. Especially when the person has a long history of trauma, guilt, and mental health instability. Especially when they've been conditioned to believe they're the problem. Nick had been called a disappointment for decades. He had been blamed, silenced, excluded. And now, with both parents dead, maybe, in his mind, it had to be his fault. Because when you're raised in dysfunction, you start believing that everything is your fault. Even the things you didn't do. Especially the things you didn't do. But there's another possibility. One darker, more disturbing. What if the confession wasn't just false? What if it was coached? We're not talking about some wild conspiracy here. We're talking about the subtle pressure that can happen in an interrogation room. The power dynamics. The leading questions. The suggestion of memory. It only takes a few nudges. A few phrases like, "Just tell us what we already know. We know you did it. We just want to understand why. If you cooperate, this can go easy. If you don't talk, things will get worse." Now layer that onto a man like Nick, fragile, isolated, grieving, unstable. And you've got a recipe for the perfect false confession. Not because he's evil, but because he's broken. And because someone needed the case closed quickly. Here's where things get really uncomfortable. The original recording of the confession? Gone. Not lost. Not deleted. Just unavailable. Police say there was a malfunction with the body cam and the room recorder. No backup audio. No video. Just typed notes. Summarized statements. Written by an officer who has since gone on leave. Convenient? Or calculated? Because when the most critical piece of evidence vanishes, and no one blinks, something is deeply wrong. And that's not all. When Nick's public defender requested access to forensic evidence, half of it hadn't even been processed. Fingerprint tests, pending. Toxicology, incomplete. Surveillance footage, partially reviewed. So why rush the confession? Why file charges before the evidence was even in? Unless the confession was the plan all along. Remember this. The Reiners were not just any family. They were Hollywood royalty. A scandal this big? A death this messy? The industry wanted it cleaned up. Neatly, quietly, immediately. And what better way to control the narrative than a son confessing? No trial. No media circus. Just tragedy. And closure. The public weeps. The story ends. Except it didn't end. Because the cracks were already showing. Even those close to the family started asking questions. A family friend told reporters off the record, "Nick's not a killer. He's been lost for years, but he wouldn't hurt them. Especially not her." Another said, "If he did it, it would have been loud, messy. This was clean. Too clean." And then came the anonymous tip. A voicemail left on a journalist's phone. 7 words. He didn't do it. Check the cameras. No name. No return number. Just static at the end. The cameras? Yes. The Reiner estate had a full surveillance system. Front gates. Back patio. Hallway cams. But get this. The footage between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. that night? Missing. Hard drive error, they say. Corrupted data. No backup. A 4-hour gap. Exactly the window in which Rob and Michelle are believed to have died. Again, convenient? Or orchestrated? Because now, not only is the confession unreliable, the timeline is too. Here's the part that should haunt you. The last verified sighting of Rob and Michelle alive was at 8:47 p.m. A food delivery driver saw them through the kitchen window, setting the table. Nick didn't arrive at the house until 10:13 p.m. That's over an hour later. So unless he was already inside, or unless the timestamp is wrong, or unless he didn't do it, then someone else was there, and no one is talking about it. So now we're left with 2 possibilities. Nick Reiner, a man with no prior violence, no weapon, no clear motive, suddenly murdered both parents, confessed vaguely, and calmly called it in. Or Nick Reiner walked into a scene already staged, and was fed a story that he eventually believed himself. Either way, the confession doesn't hold, and neither does the case. But what came next pulled everything into question, and no one saw it coming. Walls don't talk, but they remember. And inside the Reiner home, every room whispered a version of the truth that Nick's confession couldn't explain. You know what the police missed? Not the cameras, not the timeline, not the confession, the house. Not just where the crime happened, but how it was arranged, what it said, and what it refused to say. Because that home wasn't just a crime scene. It was a monument, a temple built around image, order, legacy. And when you start to look closely, really look, you realize something chilling. The house doesn't support the story. It contradicts it. Let's begin at the entry point. Police say there was no forced entry, no smash locks, no busted doors, no broken windows. The alarm system? Still active when they arrived. No record of it being disabled or triggered. So how did Nick get in? Did he have a key? Maybe. But here's the twist. Nick had been locked out weeks prior. According to home staff logs, Michelle had quietly revoked Nick's keycode access 2 weeks before the incident. Why? No one knows. Was it precaution? Or was something happening inside the house that she didn't want Nick to see? Now move to the kitchen, where the lights were still on. Plates on the table. 2 half-full glasses of wine. Food mostly untouched. It looked like they were just about to eat. or had just finished. But no signs of distress. No overturned chairs. No broken dishes. No dropped utensils. So if Nick snapped, like he allegedly confessed, why wasn't there any evidence of a struggle? A man with a history of emotional volatility suddenly turns into a cold, calculated executioner? Without noise, without chaos, without damage. It doesn't track. And then there's the staircase. Rob was found at the bottom, face down, neck broken, no other injuries. Michelle was found upstairs in the guest room, on the floor. No blood, no bruises, no defensive wounds. So let's get this straight. Nick allegedly killed both parents in separate parts of the house, with no weapon, no noise, no mess, and then called the police from the front lawn? Come on. Even the cleanest crimes leave fingerprints. This one left confusion. Let's talk about Rob's body. He had a clean break at the base of the neck, the kind consistent with a blunt fall, not an attack. Forensics suggest he may have fallen down the stairs, not been pushed, not hit, fallen. But how? Was he running? Surprised? Or was it staged? A scuffle gone wrong? Or something else entirely? Now here's where it gets bizarre. Michelle's body was found not in the master bedroom, but in the guest suite, fully dressed, lying flat on the floor, arms at her side, like she had laid down. But there was no bed in that room, no sheets, no blanket, just hardwood. And here's the twist. That room, it had recently been cleared of furniture. Why? According to cleaning staff, Rob had ordered a deep clear of the guest suite just days before the incident. No reason given. No one had used that room in months. Until that night. It gets stranger. Michelle's phone was missing from the room, later found in the garage. Screen shattered. SIM card removed. But her last call? That 1-minute ring to Nick at 11:06 p.m. Was she hiding from something? Was she trying to warn him? Was someone else in the house? And then, footprints. There were 2 sets. One consistent with Nick's shoes, found near the front door, and one smaller, barefoot, leading from the guest suite to the back patio. They belonged to Michelle. But why barefoot? And why outside? Was she trying to flee? Sleepwalking? Or had someone moved her? Because the time of death window places her final moments after Rob's. Yet the layout of the house suggests she would have heard something if Rob had fallen. So either she wasn't there yet, she had already been subdued, or someone made sure she couldn't respond. Now shift to the surveillance room. Yes, the Reiner estate had a full security setup. But this part? It's damning. The internal camera feed, hardwired into a digital recorder, shows no footage for a 4-hour block. The official report calls it a data corruption error. But tech experts called in by Nick's lawyer said this. The footage wasn't lost. It was wiped, manually, by someone with access. Someone who knew the system. Someone who had a reason to erase that night. And here's where it clicks. Only 2 people in that household had that access. Rob and Michelle, not Nick. And what about the safe? Located in Rob's study. Left open. No signs of forced entry. Inside, some cash, jewelry. But one thing missing. A red leather notebook. According to his assistant, Rob kept a handwritten journal there. Personal notes. Reflections. Names. Names of who, you ask? She hesitated. Then said, people who wronged him. People who crossed him. Stuff he couldn't tweet about. Chilling. So where is it? Gone. No trace. Not found in the house. Not found in evidence. Gone. And suddenly, this doesn't feel like a family implosion anymore. It feels like a message. Or a cleanup. Back to Nick. His fingerprints weren't found on any of the objects in the house. Not the wine glasses. Not the door handles. Not the staircase railing. His shoes were clean. His clothes? No blood. No trace. Even the doormat, a plush ivory rug, showed no signs of disturbance. So ask yourself, if you commit 2 murders in 2 different rooms, wouldn't something be left behind? Unless you didn't commit them. Unless you walked in after it was already over. Unless you were meant to find it. Unless you were the fall guy. Now think back to that call Michelle made. A 1-minute call to Nick. At 11:06 p.m. He doesn't answer. He calls back. No answer. But here's what you didn't hear in the official report. She also sent a text. A single sentence. Please don't come. Deleted. Recovered later from Cloud Sync. That text changes everything. Because if Michelle was scared of Nick, she wouldn't have called him. She wouldn't have begged him to stay away. Unless she knew he'd be walking into something. Unless she was trying to protect him. Unless someone else was already there. So now the house is speaking. And what it says is deafening. The layout, the timing, the lack of struggle, the wiped surveillance, the missing notebook, the unreplied text. Every detail whispers the same thing. Nick didn't do this. Or at least, he didn't do it alone. And whoever did, they knew what they were doing. They knew where to walk, what to touch, what to erase. They didn't leave fingerprints, but they left intent. And that's more terrifying than blood. So now we ask, was this a murder-suicide? No. Too clean. Too curated. Was it rage? No evidence of force or chaos. Was it Nick? The house says no. So who? And why? And most importantly, who's keeping that truth locked behind silence? Because the next clue didn't come from evidence bags or autopsy reports. It came from a system designed not to reveal truth, but to protect power. And what came next would shatter everything we thought we knew, and no one saw it coming. In Hollywood, when a scandal gets too close to power, the lights don't turn on, they get dimmed. So who turned down the lights on the Reiner story? Silence. Not the kind that happens when people are grieving. The kind that happens when people are instructed not to speak. That's what emerged in the days following the Reiner tragedy. Not just shock, not just speculation, but a weird, deliberate stillness. PR firms stopped returning calls. Longtime collaborators vanished from comment. Even Rob's political allies, people who had once praised him publicly, posted nothing. No tribute, no condolences, no outrage, just nothing. It was as if a switch had been flipped. And if you followed Hollywood long enough, you know what that means. Someone powerful is cleaning up, because that's how the industry works. You think it's about talent? It's about leverage. You think it's about truth? It's about control. And Rob Reiner had control, not just over his public image, but over institutions. He had friends in politics, friends in law, friends in the upper crust of media. For decades, he cultivated alliances, not just to protect himself, but to make himself untouchable. And when a man like that dies in suspicious circumstances, the silence isn't just eerie. It's tactical. Let's take a closer look at the Reiner ecosystem. First, the studios. Rob didn't just direct films. He was deeply embedded in the business. His company, Castle Rock Entertainment, had long-standing relationships with major players, Warner Brothers, Sony, Netflix. He had a reputation for being the adult in the room. The one who knew how to walk into an executive office and get a green light with a handshake. That kind of respect doesn't disappear overnight, and neither does the instinct to protect it. Within 48 hours of his death, reps from 3 major studios issued the same statement. We are deeply saddened by the passing of Rob Reiner. Our thoughts are with the family during this difficult time. Cut. Paste. No deviations. Not one mention of Michelle. Not one word about how they died. Not even a comment about Nick. Just fog. And it wasn't just Hollywood staying quiet. It was Washington. Rob had long been one of the most politically active filmmakers in the game. Donor to Democratic causes. Organizer of PACs. Co-founder of the Committee to Investigate Russia. He had the private numbers of senators. He was at fundraisers, roundtables, donor retreats. He'd even met with 2 U.S. presidents in the last decade, on record. But when the news broke, crickets. Not one statement from Capitol Hill. Not one tweet. Not even from the usual virtue signalers who jump on every Hollywood death. Why? Because Rob wasn't just a man. He was a symbol. And when symbols fall under suspicious clouds, the people who worship them have only one instinct: distance. Then there's the media. Rob had long been treated as an oracle by major news outlets. His opinions on politics were regularly featured on CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times. He gave interviews that made waves. He was a trusted voice. But once the crime hit the headlines, no coverage from those outlets went deeper than surface level. No exposés. No timeline reconstructions. No investigative dives. Compare that to what happens when any other celebrity gets caught in a scandal. They go nuclear. Wall-to-wall specials. Red string conspiracies. Leaked documents. But with Reiner? A few articles. Then radio silence. Let's put this in perspective. A double death. In an elite Los Angeles neighborhood. Involving a Hollywood legend. And a confession from his son. And yet, less coverage than a celebrity divorce. Why? Because people with power made it clear, don't touch this. One journalist from a major outlet, who asked not to be named, said this. We were told to wait, to stand down, that there were sensitive legal matters, and to avoid speculation. But I've covered murders before. I've never seen a lockdown like this. Another added. It felt like trying to report on a black hole. Every source either ghosted or fed us the same boilerplate. Someone was managing this tightly. Let's talk about someone, because that's the most disturbing part. There's reason to believe a third party, not law enforcement, not the family, was shaping the narrative. A crisis management firm called Lysander and Cole was spotted outside the Reiner home the day after the incident. Not LAPD, not CSI, PR. Lysander and Cole is known for one thing: damage control for billionaires. They don't advertise. They don't tweet. They contain. And if they were brought in, it wasn't for Nick. He doesn't have the money or the reach. So who hired them? And what exactly were they cleaning up? Let's rewind again. Days before the tragedy, Rob was in meetings, not with film producers, but with legal advisors. He was reportedly preparing a statement for a story about to break. A story involving political donations, shell companies, foreign interests, all rumors, of course, but enough to make some people nervous. The kind of people who don't like attention. And now, that story is dead. No whistleblower, no statement, no documents, just silence. Because Rob's death didn't just derail his legacy. It protected someone else's. Here's where things get messy. A leaked memo, allegedly from Lysander and Cole, was anonymously emailed to two reporters 3 days after the Reiners were found. It said, focus the narrative on familial tragedy. Do not deviate. Emphasize mental health, past addiction, and history of emotional distance. Under no circumstances should political motivations be entertained. That's not damage control. That's narrative engineering. That's manufacturing consent. And if that's true, then everything we've been told is a script. Nick's confession, the timeline, the silence. It's all a production, directed by power, funded by fear, wrapped in sympathy. Let's not forget, Hollywood doesn't eat its own. It protects its golden names until the very end. When someone like Rob Reiner dies under strange circumstances, the phone calls start flying. Reputations get protected. Footage gets lost. Questions get shut down. And just like that, the biggest scandal in years becomes a personal family tragedy. Wrapped in velvet. Sealed with PR. But here's the part that chills me. What if the silence wasn't just about Rob? What if Michelle knew something? What if her separation from Rob wasn't about divorce, but about distancing herself from whatever was about to come out? What if her death wasn't collateral, but insurance? Too dark? Too paranoid? Then explain the missing notebook. Explain the text message. Explain the silence. Because when powerful men die, and their wives die quietly beside them, you're not dealing with coincidence. You're dealing with cover-up. And Nick? He's not a criminal. He's not a villain. He's a diversion. A character in someone else's story. A scapegoat dropped into a vacuum of power, silence, and control. But here's the thing about scapegoats. They're meant to distract. Until someone asks, what are we really being distracted from? Because what came next exposed exactly that, and no one saw it coming. What if the most carefully hidden cracks in this story weren't between father and son, but between husband and wife? On the surface, they were the image of quiet success. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. 34 years of marriage. No cheating scandals. No tabloid meltdowns. No high-profile court battles. No social media feuds. In an industry defined by messy divorces and career-first marriages, theirs was calm, predictable, stable, or at least that's how it looked. But you and I both know, silence doesn't always mean serenity. Sometimes, silence is strategy. And sometimes, it's survival. When Rob met Michelle Singer in the late 1980s, he was a man already transformed. Fresh off the success of The Princess Bride, his career was skyrocketing. He was in his 40s, a director reinventing himself, no longer just meathead from TV. She was younger, artistic, private, elegant. They clicked. But this wasn't a whirlwind celebrity affair. No paparazzi chases. No million-dollar weddings. No press tours. Just two people stepping into each other's lives quietly, deliberately. And that tone set the rhythm for their entire relationship. Private, controlled, and, according to some insiders, strangely distant. Let's be clear. This chapter isn't about scandal. It's about disconnection. Because as we dig deeper into the events that led up to that fateful Sunday, one thing becomes clear. There were two marriages happening inside the Reiner household. One the public was sold, and one that played out behind the walls of their Los Angeles home. Start with the way they presented themselves. Red carpets? Rare. Joint interviews? Almost non-existent. Social media posts? Zero. Even in Hollywood, where many couples manufacture public intimacy for branding, the Reiners stood apart by standing apart. Some called it classy. Others, those who knew them, called it something else. Emotionally disconnected. They were never warm, said one former assistant. They operated more like business partners than lovers. Others described the house as eerily quiet, too clean, museum-like. And that's not just a vibe, it's a warning. Because when you walk into a home and feel nothing, that's not peace. That's emotional drought. But maybe Michelle didn't mind. Maybe that was the price she paid for stability, for wealth, for access, for being Mrs. Reiner. Or maybe she minded deeply, but said nothing. Because here's the thing no one talks about. Not every toxic relationship is explosive. Some are cold wars, long stretches of silence broken only by passive control. Rob Reiner, for all his activism and moral fire, was known to be intense, structured, unyielding, everything in its place. And when a man is that obsessed with order outside the home, what do you think he demands inside? The signs were subtle, like how Michelle stopped attending premieres after 2017, or how her name gradually disappeared from any public association with his work. No producer credits, no creative input, not even a +1 in event seating charts. Sources close to the couple described her as ghost-like in recent years. Still present, but fading. She was there, but not one family.